We are back, and we are joined now by Rune Moller Stahl, assistant professor in political economy at Copenhagen Business School, who wrote a piece in Jacobin along with Jonas Algers entitled "Tesla Has Bitten Off More Than It Can Chew by Picking a Fight with Swedish Unions." Rune, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's start here, because Elon Musk's here in the US, SpaceX is currently challenging the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board's court system, which is the place where unions, workers can get recourse against their employers. Like, that's his fight against unions here in the US. But as you write, he's fighting unions in Nordic countries as well. In Sweden, in particular, in this case, workers have been striking there. If you could explain to the audience what's been happening since October, or for the last few months, in Sweden's Tesla workshops.
Yeah, we've had the strikes since October. It's in the phase a relatively minor strike. It's 150 mechanics in the workshops, like the service stations in Sweden. There's no Tesla production in Sweden, so in that way it's minor. But Tesla has, for a number of years, refused to sign a collective agreement with the Swedish union. So the Swedish union, the metal workers union, IF Metall, has started this conflict, and they've been in conflict since October. It has spread. In December especially, we saw a number of unions from the other Nordic countries join in. So you have the transport unions in Denmark, Norway, Finland, dock workers, and so on. They're refusing to load Teslas off the ships in Esbjerg and these sort of things. And of course, then basically what makes this a pretty drastic conflict compared to probably what you're used to in the U.S. context is that Nordic unions, when there's no collective agreement, you can basically do a sympathy conflict. This means that it's not only the metal workers who are in conflict against Tesla at the moment, but it's basically the entire unionized workforce in Sweden. So there's no, the transport workers won't ship Teslas. No one's picking up their garbage. If they have electrical problem, the electricians won't come. They can't get anything mailed. They tried to sue the Swedish Postal Service in order to make them ship the number plates, but they lost that one. So it's a pretty drastic conflict in that way. The unions are basically able to, in these situations when there's no collective agreement, so they're not bound by labor law, they can shut down a firm completely.
It's enviable because unions in the United States, do not necessarily have that density and those abilities just statutorily. I guess if you don't mind expanding a bit more on the differences between U.S. labor unions, law over here, and Nordic and Swedish labor unions, because I know that there are very high, at least, especially relative to the United States, percentages in terms of density for these labor unions.
Yeah, it's in all of the Nordic countries in the 60s, 70s percent. Like it's different from each sector. Industries generally quite well organized. I think the metal workers have around 80%. Some of the other service sectors are a bit less. We've had the same development as in the US, where the highest levels of organization now is in the public sector unions, nurses, teachers, these sort of professions. There's also been a tendency in the last decades to see more union militancy in the public sector, both in Sweden and Denmark. We've seen the biggest strikes in public sector areas, but this is the private sector. There's I guess like when it comes to the legal framework, a lot of this quite unique from the Nordic countries is not regulated by law, but by different sets of collective agreements. So there's no legal minimum wage that's negotiated by unions with the employers and centralized collective negotiations. Like holiday, parental leave, sick leave, all of these sort of things. There might be in some areas like a very basic floor set by law, but basically everything is negotiated through these centralized negotiations. That's also why it's important to have even like a small workplace like Tesla's operations in Sweden to get them organized, because it's you risk undermining the entire system if a powerful company moves in and gets a foothold of non-organization in these labor markets. Like the floor is pretty low if you're not organized, because it's basically all dependent on the unions being able to go in and get employers to sign on to collective agreements.
This is also notable because I hadn't realized until reading your piece that the strength historically of these unions in Nordic countries is quite well documented, and you laid it out very well. But that union density is down in Sweden since. Sorry.
Yeah. No. It's down, and it's been a consistent trend since at least the 90s in all of the.
So yeah, my question was, how did that begin? Was that kind of an era of neoliberalism?
Yeah, basically, we've sort of had the same development as everywhere else. It's a bit later in most Nordic countries, where you started in the early 80s. I think Denmark probably started in the mid 80s. Sweden only they tried to sort of run full employment Keynesian policies until they had a big crisis in the early 90s. But it's basically the same story as over there, and the unions have steadily been losing ground in 30 years. There's also again, we still have some of the highest levels of organization, I think, in the world. There are a few other places in Europe that have like comparative levels, but I think like some of the most powerful unions in the world. But I think it's also like important not to romanticize this. Like the unions are very moderate in a Scandinavian context. We don't have the same sort of union militancy that you might see in places like France, Belgium, or other places. The sort of the amount of strike days it's still bigger than, for instance, in the US, but it's not very high, and it's been falling. Sweden especially has had like a very few large labor conflicts in the recent decade.
So yes, not to romanticize, but it seems the union density is much higher than, say, in the U.S. But from what I'm hearing you say, because the unions in Nordic countries determine the minimum wage through collective bargaining, they are a bit more institutionalized.
A lot more institutionalized. Yeah. It's have a lot of power, basically, no matter what. Even if you'd lose your entire organization on the ground, you'd still have the annual negotiations and these sort of things. Of course, it's based on decades, even a century of class power, but it still means that a lot of that power, as it stands now, is not tied to direct, shop floor labor action, but more to this sort of large institutionalized system of negotiation. That's also why a conflict like with Tesla is it's a bit unusual, because most employers in the Nordic countries, they choose to sign collective agreements So you have like, if you look at the coverage of collective agreements, it's bigger than the actual unionization rate would otherwise tell you, because a lot of employers simply choose to sign these agreements, to sign up to them, because if you're not on a collective agreement, you can basically face this sort of conflict. Whereas if you are under a collective agreement, the unions can't do any sort of of labor conflict. You're immune to strikes. The unions are sort of obliged to keep the peace, and even to sort of clamp down on local wildcat strikes. So it's, in that way, it's a system of industrial peace with a bigger level of union power, but still, it's there's a reason why most employers in the Nordics, even multinationals, choose to sign collective agreements. Like, I think McDonald's tried it in Denmark in the 80s, Toys R Us in Sweden, and they all ended up signing, because otherwise you face this sympathy conflict, and it is sort of the nuclear weapon in the union arsenal, because it's just so powerful when you can shut down all operations of a company.
So I guess that brings us to now, where some of these sympathy strikes are beginning for the 150-ish Tesla Swedish workers that are striking. What's happening on that front?
Again, it's mostly like the transport workers, the dock workers in the other Scandinavian countries that has signed on, refusing to ship Tesla cars, otherwise work with Tesla. You've also seen sell-offs of Tesla stock from the big pension funds that are partly union controlled. They're selling off the stock there. I'm not sure that has a big impact. But the Swedish Metal Workers Union, the IF Metall, has a big war chest. I think it's almost $1 billion. They haven't struck for a long time. The unions are also like, because they build up these strike funds that are very, very big. They're able to pay the members full wages, sometimes even more than full wages when they strike. So they won't run out of money. And the question is, what's going to happen now? Is so far there's been no signs of either the unions backing down or Tesla entering into any sort of negotiation. It's a good question. The big thing is, of course, will this spread? Will this give inspiration to Tesla workers in other places? The big thing here is the so-called Gigafactory near Berlin that's being constructed at the moment. Once it's finished, there'll be 10,000, 12,000 workers there. It'll be like the main operation in Europe. The IG Metall, the German metal workers union, is also very powerful, but so far there's been no attempt at unionizing the Tesla factory there. So the big question is, will this spread to Germany and to sort of the core of the Tesla production system? Will it spread to the US? I just saw that the UAW had done some saber rattling, and Tesla put up wages automatically. So it's I think that's more of the question. Also, what. It's a bit unpredictable what Tesla would do. I think the sensible thing would be to just sign this contract. It's not that expensive.
Elon Musk's not the most sensible guy, is what I think the world is starting to figure out. He's clearly ideologically opposed to unions.
Oh yeah. I think he called it insane, and called sort of unions these sort of lords over the. I'm not sure who the
lords and peasants system, but because unlike those lord and peasants plants at Ford and the other unionized plants in the U.S., Tesla lets the executives and the workers ride in the same elevator.
Utopia.
So checkmate.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That would
Right.
never happen in Europe or in Sweden.
So anyway, is he screwed, Elon? That's what I want to hear from this. Is he in trouble a little bit here? As
If history is our guide, then he'll be in trouble. And
okay, good.
you know, they might choose to exit the Scandinavian markets. For instance, in Denmark, Uber did that. Basically, they, from a legal side, they couldn't treat their drivers though they weren't workers. Then they chose, instead of actually, giving sick leave and a decent pay, they chose just to close operations in Denmark. They might choose to do that, but that even though the Nordic countries are small, they're still quite big markets. I think Norway especially is I think the third largest market after the UK and in Germany. In absolute numbers, they buy a lot of Teslas in Norway. Sweden's also big, Denmark to a certain extent. So it's not completely insubstantial, but if you can't run an operation, it'll be harder to sell to the Nordic market. So again, like all economic rationality would say that Tesla and Elon would sign an agreement, but again, as you said, it might be an ideological struggle. It also might be the sort of fear of inspiration for Tesla workers in other countries. So in that way, it's probably a bit more unpredictable than if this was, a more normal company.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Rune Moller Stahl, assistant professor in political economy at Copenhagen Business School. You can read the piece in Jacobin, co-written with Jonas Algers. Tesla has bitten off more than it can chew by picking a fight with Swedish unions. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.